In suburban Austin, a 68-year-old widow was about to discover devastating family betrayal. What started as Christmas Eve dinner became shocking when she faced locked doors at her own family celebration. Alice Thompson wasn't your typical grieving mother. For 30 years, she'd counseled troubled teens, known for unwavering wisdom and quiet strength. When she encountered her son's deliberate avoidance through the window, she had no idea she was walking into a calculated plan to exclude her from the holiday she'd hosted for decades. Alice's refusal to leave would lead to a revelation that shattered everything. She still owned the house they were locking her out of. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Alice Thompson's weathered hands gripped the steering wheel of her cream-colored Honda Civic as she turned onto Maple Street, the familiar curve of asphalt that had welcomed her home for over 3 decades. The December morning air carried the crisp promise of Christmas, and through her windshield, she could see the neighborhood dressed in its holiday finest. Wreaths adorning front doors, twinkling lights wrapped around oak trees, and inflatable snowmen standing guard over frost-kissed lawns. In the passenger seat sat her contribution to the day, a ceramic dish containing her famous bourbon pecan pie, the recipe passed down from her own mother, and beside it, a carefully arranged stack of wrapped presents, each one chosen with the meticulous care of someone who had 8 months to think about what might bring joy to faces she missed seeing every day. Her heart fluttered with the same nervous excitement she'd felt every Christmas Eve for 30 years. 31, actually, if she counted this one. The tradition had begun when Michael and Jennifer first moved into the house on Sycamore Drive, young and overwhelmed with mortgage payments and dreams bigger than their bank account. Alice had suggested hosting Christmas dinner to help them save money, and somehow, year after year, it had become the cornerstone of their family's holiday celebration. She turned right onto Sycamore Drive, her pulse quickening as the familiar red brick ranch house came into view. The house looked beautiful, she noted with pride. Jennifer had outdone herself with the decorations this year. Garland wound around the porch columns, and a magnificent wreath hung on the front door, its red velvet bow catching the morning sunlight. Alice pulled into the driveway, careful to park on the far right as she always did, leaving room for Sarah's car and David's rental, if he'd managed to make it this year. The thought of David brought a familiar pang of longing. Her eldest son had called last week, his voice distant and distracted as always, explaining that the kids had commitments and the flights were expensive. She'd told him she understood, but the words had felt like swallowing glass. Gathering her purse, the pie, and the presents, Alice made her way to the front porch, her sensible shoes clicking against the concrete steps. The porch swing, where she and Robert used to sit on summer evenings, swayed gently in the morning breeze, and for a moment, she could almost see him there, his reading glasses perched on his nose, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands as he watched the neighborhood wake up. She reached for the door handle, expecting it to turn as it had every Christmas Eve for 3 decades. It didn't budge. Alice frowned, shifting the presents to one arm and trying again. Still locked. She pressed the doorbell, listening to the familiar 2-tone chime echo inside the house. Through the frosted glass panels flanking the door, she could see movement, shadows passing back and forth in what she knew was the dining room. "Hello?" she called out, rapping her knuckles against the wood. "It's me! My hands are full!" No response. Setting the presents down on the porch swing, Alice cupped her hands against the living room window, peering through the gap in the curtains. Her breath caught in her throat. The dining room table was set for Christmas dinner, but not with her grandmother's china service, the delicate blue and white pattern that had graced every Thompson family Christmas for as long as anyone could remember. Instead, Jennifer's modern white dishes gleamed under the chandelier, elegant in their simplicity but foreign to everything Alice associated with this day. Jennifer moved through the room with purposeful efficiency, adjusting napkins and straightening silverware. She wore a burgundy dress Alice had never seen before, her hair styled in an elaborate updo that spoke of salon visits and special occasions. When Jennifer glanced toward the window, Alice waved and smiled, but her daughter-in-law's expression didn't change. She simply turned away, disappearing into the kitchen. Alice's smile faltered. She tried the doorbell again, holding it longer this time, the chime ringing insistently through the house. Still nothing. Her phone buzzed in her purse, and for a moment, hope fluttered in her chest. But it was only a text from Sarah. "Running a bit late, Mom. Amanda's daughter had a meltdown about leaving her new puppy. Should be there by noon. Love you." Alice typed back quickly. "No problem, sweetheart. See you soon." She didn't mention that she was locked out. No need to worry, Sarah, when this was obviously just some kind of misunderstanding. She called Michael's number, listening to it ring once, twice, 3 times before going to voicemail. "Hi, you've reached Michael Thompson. Leave a message, and I'll get back to you." The automated voice felt cold, impersonal. "Michael, it's Mom. I'm here for Christmas dinner, but the door seems to be locked, and I don't think you can hear the doorbell. Could you let me in? I have presents, and the pie is getting cold." She tried to keep her voice light, but even to her own ears it sounded strained. Jennifer's number went straight to voicemail. Alice stood on the porch, presents scattered around her feet, and felt the first real stab of unease pierce through her confusion. The December air was crisp enough to see her breath, and she pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders. Through the window, she could see Michael now, adjusting something on the mantelpiece. He was so close, just 20 feet away, but he might as well have been on another planet. "Excuse me, dear. Is everything all right?" Alice turned to find her neighbor, Mrs. Wilson, approaching from the sidewalk. Edith Wilson was 83 years old and had lived next door for as long as Alice could remember. She walked with a cane now, her white hair hidden beneath a knitted hat, but her eyes were as sharp as ever. "Oh, hello, Mrs. Wilson. Merry Christmas Eve." Alice forced a smile. "I seem to be having a little trouble with the door. I think something might be wrong with the lock." Mrs. Wilson's weathered face crinkled with concern. "That's odd. I saw Jennifer leave early this morning to pick up something for dinner, and she came back about an hour ago. Seemed fine then." She paused, studying Alice's face. "Have you tried calling them?" "Yes, but—" Alice's voice trailed off. How could she explain that her own son wasn't answering his phone when she was standing on his doorstep? Mrs. Wilson's expression grew more troubled. "Alice, dear, I don't want to speak out of turn, but I couldn't help noticing there seemed to be some tension when Jennifer was bringing in groceries earlier. She looked, well, determined about something." The word hit Alice like a physical blow. Determined. Not rushed, not busy with Christmas preparations. Determined. "I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding," Alice said quietly. But even as the words left her lips, she knew they weren't true. The pieces were falling into place now. The changed locks, the unanswered calls, Jennifer's deliberate avoidance of the window. This wasn't an accident or oversight. This was intentional. Mrs. Wilson seemed to sense Alice's realization. "Would you like to come over for some coffee while you sort this out? It's getting cold out here." Alice looked at the house. Her house, though only she knew that particular truth, and felt something harden in her chest. Not anger, exactly, but a quiet determination that matched the protective instinct she'd developed over 8 months of learning to navigate the world without Robert. "Thank you, but I think I'll wait here," she said, settling onto the porch swing among her scattered presents. "This is my family's Christmas, Mrs. Wilson. I've been hosting it for 30 years, and I don't intend to miss it now." Mrs. Wilson nodded slowly, understanding passing between the two women. "Well, if you need anything, you know where to find me." As her neighbor walked away, Alice sat on the swing that had witnessed 3 decades of family life. Children's laughter, quiet conversations with Robert, late-night talks with Sarah about boys and college and dreams. The house rose before her, solid and familiar, filled with people she loved who had decided, for reasons she couldn't yet fathom, that she didn't belong inside. But this was her porch, even if they didn't know it. Her swing, her property, her family. Whatever had led to this moment, whatever complicated emotions and unspoken resentments had culminated in changing the locks on Christmas Eve, Alice Thompson wasn't going anywhere. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the porch, where she sat surrounded by wrapped presents and the growing certainty that this Christmas would be unlike any that had come before. Inside, she could see the shapes of her family moving through rooms she'd decorated, around furniture she'd helped choose, preparing for a celebration that had somehow become theirs instead of ours. Alice pulled her coat tighter and settled in to wait. Michael's hand trembled as he reached for the front door handle, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird desperate for escape. Through the frosted glass, he could see his mother's silhouette on the porch swing, still and patient as a monument to 30 years of family tradition. The weight of what they'd done, what he'd allowed Jennifer to orchestrate, pressed down on his shoulders like a physical burden. He'd been pacing the living room for the better part of an hour, stealing glances through the curtains, watching his mother sit among her carefully wrapped presents with a dignity that made his stomach churn with guilt. Jennifer had retreated to the kitchen after Alice's arrival, busying herself with last-minute preparations and pointedly avoiding any discussion about the woman sitting on their porch. "Just talk to her," Jennifer had said earlier that morning, her voice carrying the sharp edge it took on when she felt cornered. "Tell her we need space. Tell her we're starting our own traditions. Tell her whatever you need to tell her, but make her understand that this is our house now." Our house. The words had felt wrong even then, though Michael couldn't quite articulate why. His mother had been nothing but generous when they'd faced foreclosure 3 years ago, quietly arranging the deed transfer that had saved them from losing everything. At the time, it had felt like salvation. Now, watching her sit excluded from the very home she'd helped them keep, it felt like something much more complicated. The door opened with a soft click, and Michael stepped onto the porch, the December air hitting his face like a slap of reality. His mother looked up from the swing, her brown eyes, so much like his father's, searching his face with an expression he couldn't read. "Michael," she said simply, her voice steady despite the obvious strain of the morning. "I was beginning to wonder if something had happened to you." He couldn't meet her gaze directly. Instead, his eyes focused on the presents scattered around her feet, each one wrapped in the same careful paper she'd used every Christmas for as long as he could remember. The sight of them made his throat tight. "Mom, we need to talk." Alice folded her hands in her lap, the gesture so familiar it made his chest ache. "I gathered that much when you changed the locks without telling me." The quiet accusation hit him harder than shouting would have. Michael ran a hand through his hair, a nervous habit that had followed him from childhood. "It's not. It's complicated, Mom." "Then uncomplicate it for me." Her tone remained even, but he caught the slight tremor beneath the surface. "Help me understand why I'm sitting on the porch instead of in the kitchen, preparing Christmas dinner the way we have for 30 years. Michael glanced back toward the house, where he could see Jennifer's shadow moving behind the kitchen window. His wife had made her position clear. This was about establishing boundaries, about claiming their space as a nuclear family without the constant presence of his mother hovering over every decision they made. "Jennifer feels," he began, then stopped, hating how the words sounded even as he formed them. "We feel like it's time to start our own Christmas traditions. As a family." "I see." Alice's voice grew quieter. "And I'm not family? That's not what I meant." The protest came out sharper than he'd intended. "You know your family, Mom. But Jennifer thinks, we think, that maybe it's time for us to host Christmas our way. Without me." She finished the sentence he couldn't bring himself to complete. Michael's jaw clenched as years of frustration bubbled to the surface. "You have to understand, Mom. Every holiday, every family dinner, every decision about the kids, you're always there. Jennifer feels like a guest in her own home sometimes. Like she can't make a move without your input or approval." Alice was quiet for a long moment, studying his face with the same careful attention she'd once given to troubled students in her counseling office. "Has Jennifer told you this directly, or is this something you've assumed?" The question caught him off guard. We've talked about it, about needing space to be our own family." "For weeks," you said on my voicemail. "You've been planning this for weeks." Alice's tone remained level, but something had shifted in her posture. Which means this isn't a spontaneous decision about Christmas traditions. This is something else entirely. Through the window, Michael caught sight of Jennifer peering out from behind the kitchen curtain before quickly ducking back out of view. The gesture felt cowardly, leaving him to handle a conversation that had been as much her idea as his. Look, Mom, I know this is hard, but Jennifer and we need to establish our independence. Dad's been gone 8 months, and we can't keep having you solve our problems or make our decisions for us. What problems am I solving, Michael? What decisions am I making? The questions hit like physical blows because he couldn't answer them specifically. It wasn't any one thing his mother did. It was the accumulation of small moments, the way she'd appear with groceries when money was tight, or offer unsolicited advice about the children's schooling, or simply be present in their lives with a consistency that sometimes felt suffocating. It's not about specific things, he said weakly. It's about feeling like adults in our own space. Alice stood up from the swing, her movement deliberate and controlled. For a moment, Michael thought she might leave, and he felt a confusing mixture of relief and panic at the prospect. Instead, she picked up her purse and extracted a folded piece of paper from an inner pocket. Her hands were steady as she unfolded it, though Michael noticed the slight tremble in her fingers. "Michael," she said quietly, "I need you to look at this." He took the paper from her hands, his eyes scanning the legal text with growing confusion that quickly transformed into shock. It was a property deed, the deed to the house they were standing in front of, with his mother's name clearly listed as the legal owner. "I don't understand," he said, though part of him was beginning to understand all too well. 3 years ago, when you were facing foreclosure, I arranged for the deed to be transferred to help you qualify for loan modification, but I retained legal ownership for tax purposes. Alice's voice was matter-of-fact, as if she were discussing the weather. "I never thought it would be relevant. I certainly never imagined I'd need to remind you that this is still, technically, my house." The words hit Michael like a physical force, knocking the breath from his lungs. All of Jennifer's talk about their house, their space, their right to establish boundaries, it had been built on a foundation that wasn't entirely solid. "Mom, he started, then stopped, realizing he had no idea how to finish that sentence. "I'm not telling you this to hurt you, Michael. I'm telling you because I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about our relationship." Alice took the deed back from his nerveless fingers and returned it to her purse. "I've never tried to control your family or make decisions for you. I've tried to support you. There's a difference." Michael stared at his mother, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time in months. Not as the overbearing presence Jennifer had painted her as, but as a woman who had lost her husband 8 months ago and was now discovering that her son, her family, saw her as a burden to be managed rather than a person to be loved. "We didn't know," he said lamely. "About the deed? No, I suppose you didn't. But that's not really the point, is it?" Alice sat back down on the swing, suddenly looking every one of her 68 years. "The point is that you've been planning for weeks to exclude me from Christmas. My Christmas. Our Christmas. And you thought the easiest way to handle it was to simply lock me out." The truth of her words settled over him like a heavy blanket. They hadn't just changed the locks. They'd changed the fundamental nature of their family without ever having a real conversation about what that meant, or whether it was what anyone actually wanted. "Jennifer thinks," he began. "I don't want to hear what Jennifer thinks right now," Alice interrupted, her voice finally showing some of the strain she'd been holding back. "I want to hear what you think, Michael. What you really think about sitting here, explaining to your mother why she's not welcome at Christmas dinner." The question hung in the air between them, and Michael realized he didn't have a good answer. All he had were Jennifer's arguments and his own vague sense that somehow, in some way, establishing this boundary was important for his marriage and his family. But looking at his mother now, seeing the careful way she held herself together despite the obvious hurt in her eyes, he couldn't remember why any of that had seemed more important than simply picking up the phone and having an honest conversation. From inside the house came the sound of footsteps, and both Michael and Alice turned to see Jennifer appear briefly at the living room window before disappearing again, leaving nothing but the sense of being watched and judged. "She's afraid," Michael said suddenly, the words surprising him even as he spoke them. "Of what?" of never being enough, of always being compared to you and Dad, of feeling like she doesn't measure up to 30 years of family history. The admission felt like pulling a splinter from a wound. She grew up in chaos, Mom. Her family, it wasn't like ours. She doesn't know how to be part of something stable without feeling like she's going to lose it somehow. Alice considered this, her expression softening slightly. And you think the solution is to choose between your wife and your mother? I don't know what the solution is, Michael admitted. I just know that I'm tired of feeling like I'm always in the middle, trying to make everyone happy and failing at it. You're 42 years old, Michael. When did you start thinking that managing other people's emotions was your responsibility? The question hit deeper than she probably intended. Because the truth was, he'd been managing emotions his whole life. Smoothing over conflicts, avoiding difficult conversations, taking the path of least resistance even when it meant sacrificing things that mattered to him. Just like he was doing now. What do you want me to do, Mom? The question came out more desperate than he'd intended. Tell me what you want me to do. Alice looked at him for a long moment, and in her expression he saw not judgment, but something that looked almost like pity. I want you to figure out what you want to do, Michael. Not what Jennifer wants, not what you think I want. What you want. She stood up again, gathering her purse and one of the smaller presents from the pile around the swing. I'm going to sit here until you do. Because this is my porch, on my property, and I have nowhere else I need to be today. As she settled back onto the swing, Michael felt the weight of her words and the deed in her purse and 30 years of Christmas mornings that had started in this house with his family, gathered around the tree his father always insisted on cutting down himself. The standoff was no longer just about Christmas dinner. It had become something much larger, a reckoning with what family meant and what they were all willing to sacrifice to avoid having difficult conversations. Michael looked toward the house, where Jennifer waited in the kitchen, then back at his mother, who sat with quiet dignity among her scattered presents. The sound of car doors slamming carried across the crisp morning air, followed by a child's excited voice calling, "Grandma Alice!" Alice looked up from the porch swing where she'd been sitting for nearly 2 hours, her body stiff from the cold and her heart heavy with the weight of rejection. A burgundy Subaru Outback sat in the driveway behind her own car, and Sarah Thompson was already moving toward the porch with the efficient grace of someone accustomed to managing crises. "Mom?" Sarah's voice carried the particular blend of concern and confusion that Alice had come to associate with her younger daughter's therapeutic training. "What are you doing out here?" Behind Sarah, Amanda Pierce emerged from the driver's side, her tall frame unfolding with deliberate calm. Even in travel clothes, dark jeans and a gray sweater, Amanda carried herself with the confidence of someone who built structures designed to last. Their daughter Lily, 9 years old and vibrating with Christmas excitement, bounded toward the porch with the fearless energy of childhood. "We're early," Lily announced, as if this explained everything. "Mama Sarah said we could drive through the night because I slept in the car and she drank lots of coffee." Alice managed a smile for her granddaughter, but Sarah's trained eye was already cataloging the scene. Alice on the porch with her gifts, the house clearly occupied but Alice clearly excluded, the subtle signs of distress in her mother's posture despite her composed exterior. "Mom," Sarah said again, her voice gentler now, "why aren't you inside?" The question hung in the morning air like a challenge. Alice could lie, could manufacture some excuse about enjoying the fresh air, or waiting for everyone to arrive. But looking at Sarah's concerned face, at Amanda's quietly observant stance, at Lily's innocent confusion, Alice found herself unable to pretend. "The locks have been changed," she said simply. "I've been locked out." Amanda's eyebrows rose slightly, and Alice watched her exchange a quick glance with Sarah. It was the kind of wordless communication that came from 15 years together, a conversation conducted entirely in expressions that Alice had learned to recognize if not decode. "Locked out?" Sarah's professional composure cracked slightly. "But it's Christmas Eve. Surely there's some mistake." "There's no mistake, honey." Alice's voice carried the weight of 2 hours' worth of realization. This was planned. Sarah's expression shifted through several stages of processing: denial, confusion, and finally a dawning understanding that brought with it a particular kind of anger. Alice had seen that look before, during family therapy sessions Sarah had insisted on after Robert's death, when her daughter's professional mask slipped to reveal the fierce protectiveness underneath. "Where are Michael and Jennifer?" Sarah's voice had taken on the carefully controlled tone she used when managing difficult family dynamics. "Inside," Alice said, gesturing toward the window where movement was still visible. "They know I'm here." Amanda had remained silent during this exchange, but now she stepped forward, her architect's eye taking in the details of the situation with practical assessment. "How long have you been out here?" "Since about 8:30. "It's almost 11, Amanda said, and there was something in her tone that made Alice look at her more carefully. Amanda had grown up in foster care, had learned early to recognize the signs of family dysfunction and to name it clearly. She had no patience for the polite fictions that often surrounded family cruelty. "Sarah," Amanda said quietly, "this isn't a misunderstanding." Before Sarah could respond, the front door opened with a suddenness that made everyone turn. Michael emerged, clearly uncomfortable, his hair disheveled, and his expression caught between guilt and defensiveness. He was still in his pajamas, flannel pants and an old university t-shirt, and he looked like a man who had been hoping this problem would somehow resolve itself. "Sarah," he said, his voice carrying forced cheer. "You're early. We weren't expecting you until this afternoon." "Clearly," Sarah replied, her therapeutic training warring with her family loyalty. "Michael, what's going on here? Why is Mom sitting on the porch?" Michael's gaze flickered between his sister and his mother, and Alice could see him calculating, trying to find words that would minimize the situation. "It's complicated," he began. "No," Amanda interjected, her voice carrying the directness that had initially intimidated Alice, but which she'd come to appreciate. "It's really not complicated. Either you accidentally locked your mother out of Christmas, or you did it on purpose. Which is it?" The bluntness of the question seemed to strip away Michael's defenses. His shoulders sagged, and for a moment he looked like the uncertain boy he'd once been, caught in a lie and unable to maintain it. "Jennifer felt..." he started, then stopped. "We thought..." "Look, it's hard to explain." "Try," Sarah said, and her voice had shifted into what Alice recognized as her professional mode. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've excluded our mother from Christmas, and I'm having trouble understanding how that could possibly be justified." Inside the house, Alice could see Jennifer moving past the window, her posture rigid with stress. The children's voices were audible, Emma and Jake's excitement about their visiting cousins temporarily overriding the adult tension. But Jennifer didn't come to the door, didn't join the conversation that was clearly about her, as much as anyone. "She wanted to do Christmas her way this year," Michael said finally, without feeling like she had to check everything with Mom first. "She felt like she was never really the woman of the house. You know? Like Mom was still running things, even though we live here now." Sarah's expression was carefully neutral, but Alice could see the effort it took. "So the solution was to lock Mom out? On Christmas Eve?" "We thought she'd understand," Michael said, the words sounding hollow even to him. "We thought she'd maybe go to David's or, I don't know. We thought she'd figure something else out." "David's in California," Amanda pointed out with ruthless practicality. "It's Christmas Eve. What exactly did you think she was going to figure out?" Lily had been listening to this exchange with the wide-eyed attention of a child trying to understand adult complications. Now she spoke up, her voice small and confused. "Why can't Grandma Alice come inside? It's cold out here." The question, asked with a child's perfect clarity, seemed to cut through all the adult justifications and complications. Michael looked at his niece, then at his mother sitting on the porch swing with her gifts and her dignity intact, and something in his face crumpled. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he said quietly. "But it is like this," Sarah replied. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Before Michael could answer, the sound of raised voices came from inside the house. Through the window, they could see Jennifer in what appeared to be an intense conversation with someone, probably on the phone. Her gestures were sharp, frustrated, and even from a distance her distress was evident. "She's upset," Michael said, as if this explained everything. She's upset. Sarah's careful control finally snapped. She's upset? Mom has been sitting on this porch for 2.5 hours in 40-degree weather because you two decided to lock her out of Christmas, and you're worried about Jennifer being upset? Alice stood up from the swing, her joints protesting the cold and the prolonged sitting. Sarah, she said quietly, that's enough. Her daughter turned to her, eyes blazing with protective fury. No, Mom, it's not enough. This is unconscionable. You can't just… I can handle this myself, Alice said, her voice carrying the authority of a mother who had settled countless family disputes over the decades. I don't need you to fight my battles for me. But even as she said it, Alice felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the morning sun. Sarah's anger on her behalf, Amanda's practical indignation, even Lily's innocent confusion, they all spoke to something she'd been afraid of losing in the months since Robert's death. The knowledge that she mattered, that her exclusion was wrong, that someone would stand up for her when she couldn't stand up for herself. Amanda had been watching the house during this exchange, her architect's eye noting details that others might miss. There are a lot of cars in the neighborhood, she observed. And I can see curtains moving in windows. This isn't exactly private anymore. Alice followed her gaze and realized Amanda was right. The prolonged scene on the front porch had drawn attention. Mrs. Wilson was no longer the only neighbor who had noticed something amiss. The situation was becoming public in the way that suburban dramas inevitably did, and that added a new dimension to the conflict. Michael, Sarah said, her voice regaining some of its professional composure, you need to understand what you've done here. You've publicly humiliated our mother. You've made a statement about her place in this family that the entire neighborhood can see. Is that really the message you want to send? Michael looked around the neighborhood as if seeing it for the first time, and Alice watched him realize the broader implications of their actions. This wasn't just about family dynamics anymore. It was about community standing, about the kind of people they were known to be. I need to talk to Jennifer, he said finally. Yes, Alice said quietly. You do. But Michael? Her son looked at her, and she saw in his eyes the confusion and pain of a man caught between loyalties he couldn't reconcile. I want you to know that I understand some of what Jennifer is feeling. I do. But understanding it doesn't make this acceptable. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She gestured to the scene around them, herself with her gifts on the porch, the neighbors watching from their windows, the children confused by adult conflicts they hadn't created. This isn't how we solve problems in this family. This isn't who we are. Michael nodded, his face flushed with what Alice hoped was shame. He turned to go back inside, then paused. Mom, about the house. We'll talk about the house later, Alice said, her voice carrying implications that made Michael's flush deepen. Right now, we need to figure out how to salvage Christmas for those children in there. All of them. As Michael disappeared back inside, Sarah moved to sit beside her mother on the swing. Are you okay? She asked quietly. Alice considered the question seriously. Was she okay? She was cold, hurt, and facing a family crisis that threatened to redefine all their relationships. But she was also surrounded by people who loved her, who thought her exclusion was wrong, who were willing to stand up for her. And she held cards that no one else knew about yet. Legal cards that might change everything. I'm getting there, she said finally. But Sarah, I need you to let me handle this my way. Can you do that? Sarah's therapeutic instincts clearly wanted to object, but she nodded. Just promise me you won't let them walk all over you. Alice smiled, the first genuine smile she'd managed all morning. Honey, I've been managing difficult people for 68 years. I think I can handle Michael and Jennifer. Through the window, they could see the family conference that was clearly taking place inside. Jennifer's gestures were animated, Michael's posture defensive, and the children were beginning to hover at the edges of the adult conversation, sensing that something important was happening. The morning had shifted into something none of them had planned. What had started as Alice's private humiliation had become a family reckoning, and the presence of witnesses, both family and neighbors, had raised the stakes considerably. Whatever happened next would define not just this Christmas, but the family's future together. Alice pulled her coat closer and settled back into the swing. She had time. She had allies. And she had information that would change everything once she chose to reveal it. For now, she would wait and see what Michael and Jennifer decided to do with the crisis they had created. The neighborhood watched, the family argued, and Christmas Eve continued its relentless march toward a resolution that none of them could yet imagine. The sound of the front door closing behind Michael echoed across the porch like a judge's gavel, final and unforgiving. Alice remained on the swing with Sarah beside her, while Amanda stood at the porch railing, her architect's eye still cataloging the neighborhood's growing awareness of their family drama. Through the windows, they could see Michael's animated discussion with Jennifer in the living room, their gestures sharp with tension. Then came a sound that cut through all the adult complexity like a knife through paper. Emma Thompson's voice, clear and insistent, carrying through the walls with the particular authority of a 10-year-old who had reached the limits of her patience. "Why is Grandma Alice sitting outside?" The question was audible even through the glass, and Alice watched as both Michael and Jennifer turned toward their daughter. "It's Christmas Eve, and she's supposed to be inside helping with breakfast. That's what always happens." Through the dining room window, Alice could see Emma standing in the doorway between the living room and kitchen, still in her Christmas pajamas, red flannel covered with tiny reindeer. Her dark hair was tousled from sleep, but her posture was rigid, with the kind of 10-year-old indignation that could slice through adult pretense with surgical precision. Jennifer knelt down to Emma's level, her body language suggesting she was trying to explain something complicated in simple terms. But Emma wasn't having it. Her voice rose again, piercing and clear. "But why can't she come in? She has her key. She always uses her key." "Oh, sweetheart," Sarah murmured from beside Alice on the swing. "She doesn't understand." Alice watched her granddaughter through the window, seeing in Emma's rigid posture the same stubborn streak that had characterized Sarah at that age, the same refusal to accept adult explanations that didn't make logical sense. Emma had always been the family's truth-teller, the child who asked uncomfortable questions and refused to be satisfied with vague answers. The conversation inside seemed to be escalating. Michael had joined Jennifer and Emma, and now 8-year-old Jake appeared in his Spider-Man pajamas, clutching the handmade Christmas card Alice could see him holding. Jake was gentler than his sister, more likely to accept what adults told him. But, even from a distance, Alice could see his confusion. "She made them Christmas cards," Alice said quietly, remembering the excited phone call from Jake 2 weeks ago when he'd finished his project. He spent hours on it. Wanted it to be perfect for Grandma. Amanda turned from her position at the railing. What kind of people lock out someone's grandmother on Christmas Eve when there are children involved? Her voice carried the particular edge of someone who had grown up in the foster system and recognized emotional cruelty in all its forms. Before anyone could answer, the front door burst open, and Emma Thompson marched onto the porch with the determined stride of a child who had had enough of adult nonsense. She was still in her pajamas, her bare feet stepping onto the cold porch boards without apparent concern for comfort or propriety. "Grandma Alice!" Emma's voice was a mixture of relief and outrage. "What are you doing out here? Daddy says you can't come in because Mommy needs space. But that doesn't make any sense, because this is your house too." Alice felt her heart squeeze as Emma launched herself into her arms, all warm pajamas and righteous indignation. The child's embrace carried the simple, uncomplicated love that Alice had been starving for, the acceptance that said her presence was not just wanted, but essential. "Hi, sweetheart," Alice managed, her voice thick with emotion as she held her granddaughter tight. "I'm just waiting out here for a bit." "But why?" Emma pulled back to look at Alice directly, her young face serious with concern. "Are you sick? Did you forget your key? Daddy has extra keys." "I've seen them in the kitchen drawer." Behind Emma, Jake appeared in the doorway, still clutching his card. His face was streaked with tears, and he looked between his sister and his grandmother with the bewildered expression of a child whose world had suddenly stopped making sense. "Grandma Alice," Jake's voice was small and trembling, "I made you a card. It has glitter and everything. But Mommy says we have to have Christmas without you, and I don't understand why." The simple statement hit Alice like a physical blow. Here was the truth of what Michael and Jennifer had done, stripped of all adult justification and complexity. They had chosen to have Christmas without her, and they had left their children to navigate the emotional wreckage of that decision. Sarah made a sound of distress beside her, and Alice saw her daughter's hands clench into fists. Amanda's expression had gone from disapproving to frankly appalled. "Can I see your card, Jake?" Alice asked gently, extending her hand. Jake approached slowly, as if he wasn't sure he was allowed to give the card to her anymore. But Emma took charge with the fierce protectiveness of an older sister. "Of course you can give it to her, Jake. She's our grandma. Give it to her right now." Jake placed the card in Alice's hands with the solemnity of a religious offering. It was construction paper folded in half, covered with carefully applied glitter in the shape of a Christmas tree. Inside, in Jake's careful second-grade handwriting, were the words, "Dear Grandma Alice, thank you for making Christmas special every year. I love you more than all the presents. Love, Jake." Alice felt tears threaten for the first time since this ordeal began. The card represented hours of work, the kind of focused effort that 8-year-olds reserved for things that truly mattered to them. And Jake had made it for her, believing she would be there to receive it, believing Christmas would happen the way it always had. "It's beautiful, Jake," she whispered. "It's the most beautiful card I've ever received." "Really?" Jake's face brightened slightly. "I used 3 different colors of glitter. Emma said that was too much, but I wanted it to be extra special." "It is extra special," Alice assured him. "And so are you." Emma had been listening to this exchange with growing agitation. Now she turned toward the house and shouted, "Mommy, Daddy, come out here right now! This is stupid and mean and I don't like it!" Through the window, Alice could see Jennifer's stricken face as her daughter's words carried into the house. Michael appeared behind his wife, and both parents looked like people caught in a trap of their own making. "Emma, honey, come inside," Jennifer's voice came through the screen door. "It's too cold for you to be out there in your pajamas." "No!" Emma's voice carried the particular defiance of a child who had decided that adults were wrong and needed to be corrected. "I'm staying with Grandma Alice. If she can't come in, then I'm staying out here." "Me too," Jake announced, moving closer to Alice's side. "I want to be with Grandma Alice." Sarah looked at Alice with something approaching awe. "They're staging a revolt," she murmured. "A successful one, by the looks of it," Amanda added, watching Jennifer's increasingly distressed face through the window. But Alice was focused on her grandchildren, on the simple loyalty they were showing in the face of adult complications they couldn't understand. Emma had wrapped her arms around Alice's waist and was glaring at the house with the fierce determination of a 10-year-old who had chosen her side. Jake was pressed against Alice's other side, still clutching his handmade ornament. She could see now that he'd made her a construction paper angel with a yarn halo. "Are you going to be our grandma forever?" Jake asked suddenly, his voice small and worried. "Even if Mommy doesn't want you to come to Christmas?" The question revealed the deeper fear that Alice hadn't fully considered. In their child logic, being excluded from Christmas might mean being excluded from everything. If Grandma Alice wasn't part of Christmas anymore, what else might she not be part of? "Oh, sweetheart," Alice said, pulling Jake closer. "I will always be your grandma. Always. No matter what happens with grown-up stuff, I will always love you and Emma more than you can imagine." "But you won't live with us anymore," Emma said, and it wasn't quite a question. "Because Mommy and Daddy moved into your house and now you live in that apartment with the weird smell in the hallway." Alice was surprised by Emma's matter-of-fact assessment. She hadn't realized the children understood so much about the living arrangements, about the way family dynamics had shifted since Robert's death. "That's right," Alice said carefully. "I live in my apartment now. But that doesn't change how much I love you." "But it changes Christmas," Emma said with devastating child logic. "Because Christmas is supposed to be at your house with your special plates and your pecan pie and the way you make everything smell like cinnamon." The accuracy of Emma's observation hung in the air like an indictment. She had identified exactly what was being lost, not just Alice's presence, but the traditions, the sense memories, the continuity that had defined their family celebrations for a decade. "I brought the pecan pie," Alice said gently. "It's right there in that carrier." "Can we eat it out here?" Jake asked hopefully. "Like a picnic?" Quote, "It's 40 degrees," Sarah pointed out practically. "I don't care," Emma declared. "If that's where Grandma Alice has to be, then that's where we should have Christmas breakfast." The front door opened again, and Michael stepped out onto the porch. He looked haggard, like a man who had spent the morning fighting a war he was losing. Behind him, Alice could see Jennifer hovering in the doorway, her face a mask of conflicted emotions. "Kids," Michael said, his voice carrying forced authority. "You need to come inside. You're going to catch cold." "We're not cold," Emma lied with the transparent defiance of childhood. "We're fine out here with Grandma Alice." "Emma," Michael's voice took on the particular tone parents used when they were approaching the end of their patience. "This is complicated grown-up stuff. You don't understand everything that's happening here." Emma turned to face her father with the kind of withering look that only children could deliver. "I understand that you locked Grandma Alice out of her own house on Christmas Eve, and now she's sitting outside in the cold while we're inside being warm, and that's mean." The simple clarity of the statement seemed to hit Michael like a slap. He looked at his daughter, then at his mother sitting on the porch swing surrounded by gifts and grandchildren. Then at the neighbors who were no longer even pretending not to watch the drama unfolding on the Thompson front porch. "It's not her house anymore," Michael said quietly, but even he seemed to recognize how weak the words sounded. "Yes, it is," Emma replied with absolute certainty. "She lived here forever and ever, and she made it beautiful, and she knows where everything goes, and she taught Mommy how to use the oven that one time when it was broken. It's her house even if you live in it now." Alice felt something shift in her chest at Emma's declaration. Here was the 10-year-old version of the truth that Alice had been struggling to articulate, that ownership meant more than legal documents, that home was built through decades of care and memory and love. "She's right," Jake added, emboldened by his sister's courage. "And besides, Grandma Alice still has her key. I saw her try to use it. If it's not her house, why does she have a key?" The children's logic was unassailable in its simplicity, and Alice watched Michael struggle to find an explanation that wouldn't either lie to his children or admit the full scope of what he and Jennifer had done. "The locks got changed," he said finally. "Why?" Emma demanded. "Did somebody try to break in? Are we in danger?" Michael looked helplessly at his wife, who was still hovering in the doorway. The conversation had moved beyond anything they had prepared for, into territory where their children's moral clarity was exposing the fundamental wrongness of their actions. "Nobody tried to break in," Jennifer said finally, stepping out onto the porch despite the cold. She was still in her robe, her hair uncombed, and she looked like a woman who had been backed into a corner. "We changed the locks because... She stopped, unable to finish the sentence in front of her children. How could she explain that they had changed the locks specifically to keep their beloved grandmother away? How could she justify that level of deliberate cruelty to children who loved Alice without reservation? "Because he wanted to hurt Grandma Alice's feelings," Emma said into the silence, her voice carrying the devastating honesty of childhood. "That's why. You wanted her to feel bad." Jennifer's face crumpled at the accusation, and Alice saw something break in her daughter-in-law's carefully maintained composure. Here was the truth that no amount of adult rationalization could disguise. Their actions had been designed to cause pain, and they had succeeded. But they had also created something they hadn't anticipated. In trying to exclude Alice, they had forced their children to choose sides. And the children had chosen their grandmother, with all the moral clarity and stubborn loyalty that only children possessed. Alice looked at Emma and Jake, pressed against her sides in the cold morning air, defending her with the fierce love that made family worth fighting for. Then she looked at Michael and Jennifer, faced with the consequences of their actions reflected in their children's eyes. "I think," Alice said quietly, "we need to find a way to fix this, all of us, together." The porch fell silent except for the sound of the neighborhood waking up around them and the distant chime of church bells marking the passage of Christmas Eve morning. In the space between the adults' complicated resentments and the children's simple love, Alice could see the possibility of something new. Not the restoration of what had been lost, but the creation of something different and possibly better. But first, they would all have to find the courage to be honest about what they really wanted and what they were really afraid of losing. The silence that settled over the porch after Alice's words carried the weight of 30 years of family history, all of it suddenly called into question by the events of this Christmas Eve morning. Emma and Jake remained pressed against their grandmother's sides, their loyalty unwavering despite the cold seeping through their pajamas. Michael and Jennifer stood frozen in the doorway, trapped between their children's moral clarity and their own complicated justifications. It was Sarah who finally broke the stalemate, her therapeutic training kicking in as she recognized the need for someone to take charge of the deteriorating situation. "Jennifer," she said, her voice carrying professional authority tempered with family concern, "the children are getting cold. Why don't you take them inside and get them dressed while the adults figure this out?" Jennifer looked grateful for the reprieve, but Emma immediately protested. "No, I'm staying with Grandma Alice." "Sweetheart," Alice said gently, "you need to go get warm. I'll still be here." "Promise?" Jake asked, his voice small and worried. "I promise," Alice said, though she had no idea what the next few hours might bring. Emma reluctantly allowed herself to be led inside, but not before turning to deliver one final pronouncement. "This is still the stupidest Christmas ever, and when I grow up, I'm never going to lock people out of Christmas." The door closed behind the children with a soft click that seemed to echo with finality. Left on the porch were Alice, Sarah, Amanda, and Michael, who looked like a man facing a firing squad. "Sit down, Michael," Alice said, patting the porch swing beside her. "We need to talk." Michael hesitated, glancing back at the house where Jennifer had disappeared with the children, but something in his mother's tone, not demanding, not angry, but carrying the authority of someone who had managed family crises for decades, made him comply. Amanda remained standing at the porch railing, her presence a reminder that this family drama now had witnesses who wouldn't politely pretend not to notice. Sarah took the chair from the small porch table, positioning herself where she could see both her mother and brother clearly. "Tell me how this started," Alice said quietly. "Not the locks, not this morning. Tell me when you and Jennifer first decided that I was the problem." Michael was quiet for so long that Alice wondered if he would answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the exhaustion of someone who had been carrying a burden for longer than he cared to admit. "It wasn't like that, Mom. It wasn't. You weren't the problem exactly. It was more like—" He struggled for words, running his hands through his hair. "Do you remember when Dad got sick? Really sick, I mean. Those last few months." Alice felt her chest tighten. Robert's final months had been a blur of hospital visits, insurance calls, and the gradual recognition that they were losing him. "Of course I remember. You handled everything," Michael continued. "The doctors, the insurance, the decisions about treatment. You were like this force of nature. Nothing could stop you. Nothing could break you. You just kept going and going, managing everything and everyone." "Someone had to," Alice said simply. "I know. And I was grateful. We all were. But after Dad died, you didn't stop. You kept managing everything. Our finances when we were struggling with the mortgage, the kids' school stuff, family dinners, holidays. It was like you couldn't let go of being in charge of everything." Sarah was watching this exchange with the careful attention of a therapist, but Alice could see the conflict in her daughter's eyes. Professional understanding warring with personal loyalty. "Are you saying I was too involved?" Alice asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Yes," Michael said, then immediately looked stricken by his own honesty. "No. I don't know, it's complicated." "It's not that complicated," Amanda said from her position at the railing. Her voice carried the directness of someone who had no investment in family diplomacy. Either your mother's involvement was helpful and welcome, or it wasn't. Which was it? Michael shot her a look that suggested he didn't appreciate her bluntness, but Amanda's expression remained neutral. She had grown up in the foster system, where family dynamics were dissected with clinical precision, and she had little patience for the polite fictions that often surrounded family dysfunction. It was helpful, Michael admitted, but it was also overwhelming. Jennifer felt like she could never do anything right, like Mom was always watching and judging. And I felt like I wasn't really the man of the house, you know? Like I was still just Mom's little boy playing house. The words hung in the air like an accusation, and Alice felt them settle into her chest with the weight of recognition. She thought back to the past 3 years, to the way she had continued to involve herself in Michael's family life. Had she been helping, or had she been controlling? "Tell me about the mortgage," she said quietly. Michael's face flushed. "What about it? Tell me about when you were going to lose the house." The silence stretched between them, filled with memories that both of them had been trying to avoid examining too closely. Finally, Michael spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "We were 3 months behind. The bank was starting foreclosure proceedings. Jennifer was working 2 jobs. I was pulling every overtime shift I could get. But it wasn't enough." He paused, and Alice could see him reliving the shame and fear of that time. "You came over one day and found Jennifer crying at the kitchen table with all the bills spread out in front of her." Alice remembered that day with painful clarity. Jennifer had looked so young, so overwhelmed, surrounded by notices and demands and threats. The sight of her daughter-in-law's despair had triggered every protective instinct Alice possessed. "I offered to help," Alice said. "You did more than help," Michael replied. "You paid off the entire mortgage. Just like that. $43,000, like it was nothing." "It wasn't nothing," Alice said quietly. "It was most of your father's life insurance." "I know, and we were grateful. God, Mom, we were so grateful. But then you kept being involved. Coming over to check on things, offering advice about money, about the kids, about everything. And Jennifer started feeling like we weren't really adults anymore, like we were just kids you were taking care of." Sarah had been listening to this exchange with growing understanding. "Mom," she said gently, "did you ever talk to them about expectations? About what paying off the mortgage meant for your relationship going forward?" Quote, Alice considered the question and realized with growing discomfort that she hadn't. She had seen a problem, her son's family in crisis, and she had solved it. But she hadn't considered the emotional complexity of what that solution might create. "I thought I was helping," she said finally. "I thought I was being a good mother." "You were," Michael said quickly. "You are. But Jennifer has this thing about being independent. Her dad left when she was 12, and her mom couldn't handle anything on her own. Jennifer had to take care of everything: bills, groceries, making sure her mom didn't drink too much. She swore she'd never be dependent on anyone like that." The revelation about Jennifer's background hit Alice like a revelation. She had known that Jennifer's childhood had been difficult, but she hadn't understood the specific fears that drove her daughter-in-law's need for control and independence. "So when I kept being involved," Alice said slowly, she felt like history was repeating itself. Like she was back to being the child while someone else handled the adult responsibilities. "Exactly," Michael said, relief evident in his voice at being understood. "And I was caught in the middle. Grateful to you, loyal to Jennifer, trying to be a good husband and a good son, and feeling like I was failing at both." Amanda had been listening to this exchange with the kind of attention that came from her professional background in architecture, someone trained to understand how structures worked, how they carried weight, and where they were most likely to fail. "So instead of having a conversation about boundaries and expectations," she said, "you decided to lock Alice out and hope she'd get the message." Michael winced at the bluntness of the summary. "It wasn't supposed to be like this." Jennifer thought if we just had one Christmas on our own, without Mom managing everything, we could prove to ourselves that we were capable of handling our own family traditions. And you thought Alice would just, disappear quietly? Sarah's voice carried the incredulity of a mental health professional confronted with particularly poor emotional reasoning. We thought she'd make other plans, Michael said weakly. Maybe drive up to see David, or spend the day with friends from church. David lives in California, Alice pointed out. It's Christmas Eve. My church friends all have their own families to worry about. The practical impossibility of their expectations seemed to hit Michael for the first time. We didn't think it through, he admitted. No, Alice said quietly. You didn't. But more than that, you made assumptions about what I wanted and what I needed without ever asking me. She stood up from the swing, her joints protesting the cold and the prolonged sitting, and walked to the porch railing where she could see the house clearly. Through the windows, she could observe the life continuing inside. Jennifer helping the children get dressed, the Christmas tree with its carefully arranged presents, the dining room table set with the wrong china. Do you want to know what I was thinking about when I paid off your mortgage? She asked, not turning around. What? Michael's voice was barely audible. I was thinking about legacy. About what your father and I had built together, and how I could make sure it continued after he was gone. Alice turned to face her son, and her voice carried 3 decades of accumulated love and loss. I wasn't trying to control you, Michael. I was trying to take care of you the only way I knew how. She gestured toward the house. This house, your father and I bought it when you were 15. We chose it because the school district was good, because the neighborhood was safe, because we wanted to give you and David and Sarah a foundation to build on. When you got married and wanted to buy a house, we were so proud. And when you got into trouble with the mortgage. Alice's voice wavered slightly, but she continued. I couldn't stand the thought of you losing what we had all worked so hard to build. So I did what your father would have done. I fixed it. But the way you fixed it, Sarah said gently, it created new problems. Alice nodded. I can see that now, but at the time, all I could see was my son's family in crisis. And I had the power to help. How could I not help? Michael was quiet for a long moment, processing this perspective on events he had experienced very differently. When he spoke, his voice carried a mix of gratitude and frustration that Alice recognized as the complicated emotions of adult children everywhere. I wish we could have talked about this before it got to... He gestured helplessly at the scene around them. Before you locked me out of Christmas? Alice asked, and there was a trace of dark humor in her voice. Yeah, before that. Amanda, who had been quietly observing this family excavation, finally spoke up. There's something else we need to talk about, she said. Something about the house that I don't think everyone understands. Alice felt her chest tighten. Amanda's architectural background had given her an eye for details, and Alice suspected she had noticed something that the family had overlooked. What do you mean? Sarah asked. Amanda looked directly at Alice. You still own this house, don't you? The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Michael's face went white, and Sarah's eyes widened with understanding. Alice had been dreading this moment, knowing it would come but hoping to control when and how the truth emerged. What are you talking about? Michael asked, though his voice suggested he was beginning to suspect the answer. Alice sighed, feeling the weight of the secret she had been carrying for 3 years. When I paid off your mortgage, I had my lawyer structure it as a private loan secured by the property. Legally, I hold the deed. You live here. You're responsible for taxes and maintenance, but the house belongs to me. The silence that followed was deafening. Michael stared at his mother as if seeing her for the first time, while Sarah's expression shifted through surprise, understanding, and something that might have been admiration. You mean, Michael said slowly, that when we locked you out, we were locking you out of your own house? Yes, Alice said simply. That's exactly what you did. The implications of this revelation were staggering, and Alice could see Michael processing them in real time. They had not only excluded her from Christmas, they had quite literally locked the legal owner out of her own property. The moral wrongness of their actions was now compounded by a legal reality that made their position indefensible. "Why didn't you tell us?" Michael asked, though his voice suggested he suspected the answer. "Because I never thought it would matter," Alice replied. "I gave you the house to live in, to raise your children in, to make your own. The legal technicality was just insurance. Protection for everyone involved. I never imagined a situation where I would need to assert my ownership." She looked at her son with an expression that was both sad and determined. Until today. The porch fell silent as the full weight of the morning's events settled over them. What had begun as a family conflict about boundaries and traditions had become something much more complex. A reckoning with years of unspoken resentments, unexamined assumptions, and the complicated legacy of love and money and power within families. Inside the house, Alice could see the children getting dressed for Christmas, their excitement undimmed by the adult complexities swirling around them. Soon, they would want to open presents, to eat breakfast, to celebrate the holiday they had been anticipating for weeks. The adults would have to find a way forward that honored both the children's needs and the truth that had finally emerged. Alice looked at her family gathered on the porch, her son grappling with the revelation that he had less power than he thought, her daughter processing the implications with professional detachment, Amanda maintaining her role as moral witness. The morning had stripped away years of polite pretense and forced them all to confront the reality of their relationships. The question now was what they would choose to do with that truth. The revelation about the house ownership hung in the December air like smoke from a fire that couldn't be extinguished. Michael sat on the porch swing, his head in his hands, while Alice remained at the railing, her silhouette framed against the morning light. Sarah had gone quiet, her therapeutic training warring with her protective instincts, and Amanda continued her role as witness to a family unraveling in real time. The sound of Alice's phone ringing cut through the tension with jarring normalcy. She glanced at the screen and felt her stomach drop. "It's David," she said, showing the display to the others. Michael's head shot up. "Don't tell him about this, please, Mom." "Not yet." But Alice was already answering. "Hello, David. Mom, Merry Christmas Eve." David's voice came through the speaker with the forced cheer of someone fulfilling an obligation. "I wanted to call before the kids got too crazy with their Christmas morning. How are things in Texas?" Alice looked around the porch, at Michael's stricken face, at Sarah's worried expression, at the neighbors who were no longer even pretending not to watch the ongoing drama. "Oh, you know," she said carefully, "eventful." Good. Listen, I can't talk long. We're about to head to Rebecca's parents' house for their Christmas brunch. You know how her family is about their traditions." The casual dismissal of his own family's traditions wasn't lost on anyone on the porch. Sarah's jaw tightened visibly, and Alice saw Michael's expression shift from guilt to anger. "David," Alice said, "actually, there's something." "Oh, before I forget," David interrupted, "I need to talk to Michael about the house situation. Is he around?" The question fell into the conversation like a stone into still water, creating ripples that spread outward in all directions. Michael's face had gone pale, and Alice felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December morning. "What house situation?" Alice asked carefully. "The sale. Rebecca's been doing some research on Austin real estate, and she thinks Michael could get a really good price if he sells now. Market's hot, property values in that neighborhood have gone up significantly. We were thinking it might be time for him to cash out, maybe move somewhere with better schools." The silence on the porch was deafening. Alice felt the world tilt slightly as the full implications of David's words sank in. Not only had her sons been planning to exclude her from Christmas, but they had apparently been discussing selling her house without bothering to inform her that she still owned it. "David," Sarah said, her voice carrying a dangerous edge, "how long have you and Michael been discussing this?" "Sarah? I didn't know you were there." "Oh, probably a few months now. Michael was talking about wanting to get out from under the mortgage, start fresh somewhere. Makes sense, really. That house is way too big for them now that—" He stopped abruptly, apparently realizing he was about to say something tactless about Alice no longer living there. "Now that what, David?" Alice's voice was quiet, but there was steel underneath. "Well, you know, now that you're in the apartment and everything, the house must feel pretty empty with just Michael's family rattling around in it. Quote, Michael had stood up from the swing and was pacing the small porch like a caged animal. "David, we can talk about this later." "Actually," Amanda interjected, her architect's practicality cutting through family diplomacy, "this is probably something that should be discussed now, especially since Alice still legally owns the house." The silence on the phone was so complete that Alice wondered if the call had dropped. When David finally spoke, his voice had lost all its casual cheer. "What do you mean, she still owns it?" "I mean exactly what I said," Alice replied. "The deed is still in my name. When I paid off Michael's mortgage, the house reverted to me legally. I've been letting Michael's family live here, but it's my property." "That's—" David's voice trailed off as he processed this information. "That's not what Michael told me. He said you signed the house over to him when you moved out." All eyes turned to Michael, who looked like a man who had been caught in a lie that was spiraling beyond his control. I mean for all practical purposes." "For all practical purposes? Nothing," Sarah said sharply. "Either you own the house or you don't. Either you have the right to sell it or you don't. Which is it, Michael?" "I don't own it," Michael admitted quietly. "Mom does." The confession hung in the air like an indictment. David's voice came through the phone with a new edge, the tone of someone who was beginning to realize he had been operating with completely false information. "So when you called me last month talking about selling and asked me to help you find a real estate agent in Austin, you knew you didn't actually have the legal right to sell the house? You called David about selling?" Alice's voice was barely above a whisper. "You were making plans to sell my house without telling me?" Michael's pacing had become more agitated. "It wasn't like that. I was just exploring options, trying to figure out what we could do to get more independent, to not feel like we were always living in your shadow." "By selling my house out from under me?" The hurt in Alice's voice was palpable. "By making plans with your brother to dispose of the property I saved for your family?" "Jesus Christ, Michael!" David's voice came through the phone with unusual vehemence. "What the hell were you thinking? You can't sell a house you don't own." "I thought she'd understand," Michael said desperately. "I thought if we presented it as a good financial decision, she'd see that it made sense for everyone." "What made sense," Amanda said with brutal clarity, "was having an honest conversation about what everyone wanted and needed, instead of making secret plans and locking people out of their own homes." The sound of a car door slamming in the driveway interrupted the confrontation. Alice looked up to see Mrs. Wilson approaching the house, carrying a thermos, and wearing the expression of a woman who had finally decided to intervene in something that had gone on too long. "David," Alice said into the phone, "I need to go. We'll continue this conversation later." "Mom, wait." But Alice had already hung up. Mrs. Wilson was climbing the porch steps with the determined stride of an elderly woman who had decided that neighborly politeness had its limits. "Alice, dear," Mrs. Wilson said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived through the Depression and raised 5 children, "I've brought you some hot chocolate, and I think it's time we had a frank discussion about what's happening here." She turned to look at Michael with the kind of expression that retired school teachers reserved for particularly troublesome students. "Young man, I've been watching this family for 15 years. I watched your parents build a life in this house. I watched them welcome you and your wife and children. And I watched your mother grieve when your father passed. What I'm seeing today is a disgrace." Michael opened his mouth to respond, but Mrs. Wilson held up a hand that brooked no argument. "I don't want to hear explanations or justifications. I want you to think about what your father would say if he could see his wife sitting on this porch in 40-degree weather because her own family has locked her out on Christmas Eve." The words hit Michael like a physical blow. Alice saw him stagger slightly, and for a moment he looked like the grieving son he had been 8 months ago when they had buried Robert. "Mrs. Wilson," Sarah said gently, "this is a family matter." "This stopped being a private family matter when it moved to the front porch," Mrs. Wilson replied crisply. "Half the neighborhood has been watching this unfold for the past 3 hours. The Peterson children have been asking their mother why Mrs. Thompson is sitting outside in the cold. The Garcias are wondering if they should call someone. This isn't private anymore, dear." She handed Alice the thermos with the care of someone transferring a sacred trust. I don't know what's been said or done between you all, but I know what I see. And what I see is a woman who has given her whole life to taking care of her family being treated like an unwelcome stranger. Inside the house, Alice could see Jennifer moving past the windows, her posture rigid with stress. The children were no longer visible, presumably getting dressed or eating breakfast. Their Christmas morning held hostage by adult conflicts they couldn't understand. The children keep looking out the windows, Mrs. Wilson continued. They're confused and upset. Whatever problems you adults have with each other, those babies don't deserve to have their Christmas ruined by it. Michael had stopped pacing and was leaning against the porch railing, his face a mask of shame and frustration. We never wanted the children to be upset, he said quietly. Then you should have thought about that before you locked their grandmother out of Christmas, Mrs. Wilson replied without mercy. Those children adore Alice. They don't understand grown-up complications about boundaries and independence. All they understand is that Grandma is sitting outside in the cold while Christmas happens without her. Sarah had been watching this exchange with growing recognition of how completely her family had lost control of the situation. Mrs. Wilson is right, she said. This has become public. The whole neighborhood is watching. Whatever we decide to do from here, we have to consider that. What are you suggesting? Michael asked. I'm suggesting that you have two choices, Amanda said, her voice carrying the practical authority of someone who built things that had to withstand stress. You can continue this standoff and let the entire neighborhood watch your family destroy itself on Christmas Eve. Or you can figure out how to salvage some dignity and get everyone inside where this conversation should have happened in the first place. The front door opened, and Jennifer appeared in the doorway. She had dressed hastily, jeans and a sweater, and her hair was still uncombed, but her face was resolute. Alice could see that she had been crying, but she had clearly reached some kind of decision. Michael, Jennifer said, her voice steady despite the visible signs of distress. We need to talk. Inside. Now. She looked at Alice, and for a moment, their eyes met directly. Alice, I think we all need to talk. Together. It was the first time Jennifer had addressed her directly since the crisis began, and Alice heard in her daughter-in-law's voice something she hadn't expected. Not surrender, exactly, but a recognition that the situation had moved beyond what any of them had intended. The children are getting upset, Jennifer continued. Emma is refusing to open any presents until you're inside, and Jake keeps asking why Grandma has to sit outside. They don't understand, and I can't explain it to them because… Her voice wavered slightly. Because I don't think I understand it anymore either. Mrs. Wilson smiled with satisfaction. Now that sounds like sense. Alice, dear, you shouldn't have to choose between your dignity and getting warm. This is your house, isn't it? Yes, Alice said quietly. It is. She stood up from the porch swing, her joints protesting the hours of cold and tension. The thermos of hot chocolate was warm in her hands, a small kindness that felt disproportionately meaningful after the morning's cruelties. All right, she said, looking at each member of her family in turn. Let's go inside and finish this conversation properly. But I want it understood. We're going into my house to have a discussion about how this family is going to move forward. And whatever we decide, it's going to be a decision we all can live with. She walked toward the front door, and for a moment, no one moved. Then Jennifer stepped aside, holding the door open in a gesture that felt both practical and symbolic. After you, Jennifer said quietly. Alice paused at the threshold, feeling the warmth from inside the house wash over her face. Behind her, she could hear her family following, Sarah and Amanda, Michael with his shame and confusion, Mrs. Wilson with her righteous indignation still intact. But it was the sound from inside the house that decided her, Emma's voice calling out, "Grandma Alice, are you finally coming inside? We've been waiting forever." Yes, Alice thought as she crossed the threshold into her own home. They had been waiting forever. All of them. And it was time to stop waiting and start building something new from the wreckage of what they had almost destroyed. The warmth of the house enveloped Alice like an embrace as she stepped across the threshold for the first time in over 3 hours. The familiar scent of home, coffee brewing, cinnamon from her pecan pie, the lingering fragrance of the Christmas tree, hit her with an intensity that made her eyes water. Or perhaps that was something else entirely. Emma and Jake appeared at the edge of the living room, still in their pajamas, but now wearing the expectant expressions of children who believed that adult problems could be solved simply by getting everyone in the same room. Behind them, Lily bounced on her toes with the restless energy of a 9-year-old who had been promised Christmas morning but was still waiting for it to begin. "Grandma Alice!" Emma rushed forward, wrapping her arms around Alice's waist with fierce possession. "Now can we have Christmas? We've been waiting forever, and Jake hasn't even opened a single present because he said it wasn't fair without you." Alice felt her composure, so carefully maintained during the long morning on the porch, begin to crack. These children had waited. For her. They had refused to begin their Christmas celebration while she sat excluded and cold outside. The simple loyalty of it, the pure love without conditions or complications, was almost more than she could bear. "In a few minutes, sweetheart," Alice managed, her voice thick with emotion. "The grown-ups need to finish talking first." Jennifer had moved into the living room, her posture stiff with the kind of tension that comes from facing an inevitable confrontation. She gestured toward the couch, with the awkward formality of someone who wasn't sure of her authority in this space anymore. "Please, everyone, sit down," Jennifer said, then seemed to realize the absurdity of playing hostess to the woman who actually owned the house. Her face flushed, and she looked away. Michael had followed them inside, but he remained standing near the door, as if he might need to escape. Sarah and Amanda took seats on the couch, while Mrs. Wilson settled herself in Robert's old recliner, with the authority of someone who had earned the right to witness this family's reckoning. Alice remained standing, still holding Mrs. Wilson's thermos, looking around the room that had been her home for 30 years. Jennifer had done a lovely job with the decorating. The Christmas tree was perfectly positioned by the window. The mantel was arranged with tasteful garland and stockings. But something essential was missing, some warmth that couldn't be purchased or arranged. "Where are the family photos?" Alice asked suddenly. Jennifer looked startled by the question. "What?" "The photos. The ones that used to be on the mantel, on the side tables. Pictures of the children, of family Christmases. Where are they?" Jennifer's flush deepened. I put them away. I wanted the decorations to be more cohesive." "Cohesive," Alice repeated quietly. The word hung in the air like an indictment. "You removed 30 years of family memories to make the decorations more cohesive." "Mom," Sarah said gently, recognizing the dangerous edge in her mother's voice. But Alice had reached something beyond diplomacy or family peacekeeping. The hours on the porch, the revelation about the secret plans to sell her house, the discovery that her family photos had been hidden away like embarrassing reminders of an inconvenient past. It all crystallized into a moment of perfect, painful clarity. "Do you want to know what I was thinking about out there?" Alice asked, her voice steady but carrying an undertone that made everyone in the room go still. "I was thinking about all the Christmases we've had in this house. 31 years of Christmas mornings, of children opening presents under that tree, of family dinners at that table." She gestured toward the dining room, where the wrong china still waited on the table. "I was thinking about the Christmas when Emma was 3, and she got so excited about her new bike that she rode it right into the Christmas tree. Or the year Jake had the flu and spent the whole day curled up on this couch while we all took turns reading to him. Or the Christmas after 9/11 when we were all so grateful just to be together that we cried during grace." Alice's voice was gaining strength, fueled by decades of accumulated memories and the growing realization of what was being discarded. "I was thinking about your father, Michael. About how he used to spend Christmas Eve morning making his famous pancakes while I got everything else ready. About how he'd sneak into the living room to arrange the presents one more time, making sure everything was perfect for you children." Michael's face had gone white, and Alice could see him struggling with emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in months. "And then I was thinking about this year," Alice continued, "about how I spent weeks planning what I thought would be our 32nd Christmas together. About how I bought presents for everyone, made Jake's favorite pie, prepared all the dishes Michael specifically asked for. About how excited I was to see Emma and Jake's faces when they opened their gifts." She set the thermos down on the coffee table with deliberate care. "And then I realized that none of that mattered to you anymore. That somehow, in trying to help this family, in trying to honor what your father and I built together, I had become someone you wanted to get rid of. Someone whose presence was so unwelcome that you would rather lock me out in the cold than have an honest conversation about what you needed. The room was silent, except for the sound of the children shifting restlessly in the background and the tick of the grandfather clock in the corner, the one Alice and Robert had bought for their 10th anniversary. "So I made a decision out there," Alice said, her voice taking on a finality that made Sarah sit forward with concern. "I have decided to sell the house." The words fell into the silence like a bomb. Michael's face went from white to gray, and Jennifer made a small sound of distress. Even the children seemed to sense that something irreversible had just been announced. "Mom," Sarah said carefully, "let's not make any hasty decisions." "It's not hasty," Alice replied. "It's actually long overdue. You want independence, Michael? ... You want to feel like adults who can make your own decisions without your mother hovering over everything? Fine. I'll sell the house, and you can buy your own home wherever you want to live. You can start fresh, with your own mortgage, your own traditions, your own china." She looked around the room one more time, her gaze lingering on the tree, the stockings, the space where family photos used to remind everyone of their shared history. "I'll take my share of the proceeds and move somewhere I'm wanted. Maybe a retirement community in Florida, where I can play bridge and complain about the weather and not bother anyone with my inconvenient love and concern." The silence that followed was deafening. Alice could see the horror in Michael's eyes as he realized the full consequences of their actions, could see Jennifer's growing understanding that they had destroyed something irreplaceable in their quest for independence. But it was Jake's voice that finally broke the silence, small and confused and heartbroken. "But Grandma Alice, if you move to Florida, who's going to make Christmas?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything they had all been fighting about. Alice looked at her grandson, at his tear-streaked face and his confusion about why the adults were destroying something he loved, and felt her heart break completely. Because that was the question, wasn't it? If she wasn't here to make Christmas, to maintain the traditions, to remember the stories and preserve the connections, who would? Who would make sure that 31 years of family history didn't just disappear into cohesive decorating and efficient independence? Alice sat down heavily in the chair across from the couch, suddenly feeling every one of her 68 years. The fight had gone out of her, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion that came from realizing that everything she had tried to preserve might already be lost. Jake's question, "Who's going to make Christmas?" hung in the living room like smoke that couldn't be cleared away. Alice sat in the chair that had once been Robert's favorite reading spot, watching her family grapple with the implications of her decision to sell the house. The children stood frozen at the edge of the room, their Christmas morning excitement replaced by the dawning awareness that something precious was being broken. It was Jennifer who moved first. She had been standing rigid by the Christmas tree, but now she walked slowly to the couch and sat down heavily, her face pale with what Alice recognized as genuine shock. "Alice," Jennifer said quietly, "I never wanted. We never intended for things to go this far." "But they have gone this far," Alice replied, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had reached the end of her emotional reserves. "They've gone so far that my own grandchildren are asking who's going to make Christmas, because they understand something that their parents apparently don't, that family traditions don't just happen by themselves. Someone has to care enough to preserve them." Michael had moved away from the door and was now pacing the space between the living room and dining room, his agitation increasing with each step. "Mom, you can't sell the house. This is where we live, where the kids go to school, where all our friends are." "Then you should have thought about that before you decided I was expendable," Alice said with a bluntness that made Michael flinch. Sarah had been watching this exchange with the careful attention of someone trying to prevent a complete family breakdown. "Mom," she said gently, "I understand why you're hurt. We all do. But selling the house, that's going to hurt the children more than anyone else." "The children are already being hurt," Mrs. Wilson interjected from Robert's recliner, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had observed this family's dynamics for years. "They've been watching their grandmother sit outside in the cold for 3 hours on Christmas Eve. They've been told that Christmas can happen without the person who's made it special for their entire lives. How much more hurt can there be? Emma had been listening to this conversation with the wide-eyed attention of a child trying to understand adult complexities that kept shifting beyond her grasp. You want to feel like adults who can make your own decisions without your mother hovering over everything? Fine. I'll sell the house, and you can buy your own home wherever you want to live. You can start fresh, with your own mortgage, your own traditions, your own china. She looked around the room one more time, her gaze lingering on the tree, the stockings, the space where family photos used to remind everyone of their shared history. I'll take my share of the proceeds and move somewhere I'm wanted. Maybe a retirement community in Florida, where I can play bridge and complain about the weather and not bother anyone with my inconvenient love and concern. The silence that followed was deafening. Alice could see the horror in Michael's eyes as he realized the full consequences of their actions, could see Jennifer's growing understanding that they had destroyed something irreplaceable in their quest for independence. But it was Jake's voice that finally broke the silence, small and confused and heartbroken. But Grandma Alice, if you move to Florida, who's going to make Christmas? The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything they had all been fighting about. Alice looked at her grandson, at his tear-streaked face and his confusion about why the adults were destroying something he loved, and felt her heart break completely. Because that was the question, wasn't it? If she wasn't here to make Christmas, to maintain the traditions, to remember the stories and preserve the connections, who would? Who would make sure that 31 years of family history didn't just disappear into cohesive decorating and efficient independence? Alice sat down heavily in the chair across from the couch, suddenly feeling every one of her 68 years. The fight had gone out of her, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion that came from realizing that everything she had tried to preserve might already be lost. Jake's question, who's going to make Christmas, hung in the living room like smoke that couldn't be cleared away. Alice sat in the chair that had once been Robert's favorite reading spot, watching her family grapple with the implications of her decision to sell the house. The children stood frozen at the edge of the room, their Christmas morning excitement replaced by the dawning awareness that something precious was being broken. It was Jennifer who moved first. She had been standing rigid by the Christmas tree, but now she walked slowly to the couch and sat down heavily, her face pale with what Alice recognized as genuine shock. "Alice," Jennifer said quietly, "I never wanted. We never intended for things to go this far." "But they have gone this far," Alice replied, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had reached the end of her emotional reserves. "They've gone so far that my own grandchildren are asking who's going to make Christmas, because they understand something that their parents apparently don't, that family traditions don't just happen by themselves. Someone has to care enough to preserve them." Michael had moved away from the door and was now pacing the space between the living room and dining room, his agitation increasing with each step. "Mom, you can't sell the house. This is where we live, where the kids go to school, where all our friends are." "Then you should have thought about that before you decided I was expendable," Alice said with a bluntness that made Michael flinch. Sarah had been watching this exchange with the careful attention of someone trying to prevent a complete family breakdown. "Mom," she said gently, "I understand why you're hurt. We all do. But selling the house, that's going to hurt the children more than anyone else." "The children are already being hurt," Mrs. Wilson interjected from Robert's recliner, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had observed this family's dynamics for years. "They've been watching their grandmother sit outside in the cold for 3 hours on Christmas Eve. They've been told that Christmas can happen without the person who's made it special for their entire lives. How much more hurt can there be?" Emma had been listening to this conversation with the wide-eyed attention of a child trying to understand adult complexities that kept shifting beyond her grasp. Now she spoke up, her voice small but determined. "I don't want you to move to Florida, Grandma Alice. Florida is where old people go to die." The brutal honesty of the 10-year-old's statement hit the room like a slap. Alice felt tears threaten for the first time since the crisis began. Not from hurt or anger, but from the recognition that Emma had articulated exactly what selling the house would represent. It would be the beginning of the end. The first step toward becoming someone whose presence was managed and scheduled rather than integrated into the daily fabric of family life. "Emma," Jennifer said quickly, "that's not... Grandma Alice isn't going anywhere to die. She's just..." But Jennifer couldn't finish the sentence, because they all knew what Alice moving to Florida would really mean. It would mean the end of spontaneous visits, of being available for school plays and soccer games, of being the family anchor who remembered everyone's birthdays and kept track of the stories that made them who they were. Amanda, who had been quiet since they'd come inside, finally spoke. "Jennifer, can I ask you something?" Jennifer nodded, though her expression was wary. "What exactly did you think would happen after today? Let's say your plan had worked perfectly." Alice had quietly disappeared. "You'd had your independent Christmas, proved to yourselves that you could manage your own traditions. Then what?" The question was asked with Amanda's characteristic directness, but without hostility. It was the voice of an architect trying to understand the blueprint for a structure that seemed fundamentally unsound. We thought she'd understand that we needed space," Jennifer said, her voice growing smaller with each word. "That she'd step back and let us be adults." "But step back to where?" Amanda pressed. "Step back from what? From caring about her grandchildren? From wanting to be part of family celebrations? From having opinions about the house she owns?" Jennifer's composure finally cracked completely. "I don't know," she said, her voice rising with frustration and something that sounded like desperation. "I don't know what I thought would happen. I needed to feel like I was the mother, like I was the woman of this family, not some apprentice who was never quite good enough." The admission hung in the air with the weight of years of accumulated resentment and insecurity. Alice looked at her daughter-in-law, really looked at her, and for the first time saw past the defensive anger to the frightened young woman underneath. "Jennifer," Alice said quietly, "do you really think I don't see you as the mother of this family? How can you?" Jennifer's voice was thick with tears now. "You're the one they come to when they're really hurt. You're the one who knows exactly how Jake likes his sandwich cut and what bedtime story Emma needs when she's scared. You're the one who remembers every important moment and makes every holiday special. What does that leave for me?" The raw pain in Jennifer's voice silenced the room. Even the children had gone quiet, sensing that their mother was saying something important, something that might help them understand why Christmas had gone so wrong. Alice felt something shift in her chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but recognition. She had been so focused on her own exclusion, her own hurt, that she hadn't fully grasped the depth of Jennifer's insecurity. "It leaves you being their mother," Alice said simply. "Every single day, when they're sick, when they're scared, when they need comfort or discipline or just someone to listen. It leaves you being the person who shapes who they become, who teaches them how to be good people, who loves them through everything." She gestured toward Emma and Jake, who were listening with the solemn attention children reserved for moments when they sensed their world was being redefined. "I can make Christmas special, Jennifer. I can remember their favorite foods and tell them stories about their father when he was little. But I can't be their mother. Only you can do that." Jennifer was crying openly now, years of competitive anxiety finally finding release. "But you do it all so much better than I do. You never lose your patience. You always know the right thing to say. You make everything look so easy." "Easy?" Alice almost laughed. "Jennifer, I've been a mother for 45 years. I've had decades to practice, decades to make mistakes and learn from them. You've had 10 years with Emma, 8 with Jake. Of course it feels hard. It's supposed to feel hard." Michael had stopped pacing and was staring at his wife as if seeing her clearly for the first time. "Jen, why didn't you tell me you felt this way?" "Because you wouldn't understand," Jennifer said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Your mother is perfect. She never says the wrong thing, never makes mistakes, never loses control. How could I tell you that I was jealous of your mother?" "Perfect?" Alice felt compelled to interrupt. "Jennifer, I once locked Sarah in the car at the grocery store and didn't realize it for 20 minutes. I forgot David's birthday 3 years in a row when he was in middle school. I served raw chicken at Michael's high school graduation party and gave half the guests food poisoning. She looked around the room, meeting each person's eyes in turn. I'm not perfect. I never was. I'm just practiced. And yes, I love being part of this family's life. I love feeling needed and useful, but not at the cost of making you feel inadequate. Sarah had been watching this exchange with growing understanding. This is what I meant about having conversations, she said. All of this pain, all of this resentment, it could have been avoided if people had just talked to each other honestly. Instead of changing locks and making secret plans, Amanda added, her voice carrying just enough edge to remind them of the morning's betrayals. Emma, who had been absorbing this adult conversation with the seriousness of a child trying to solve a puzzle, suddenly spoke up. So can we fix it? Can we make Christmas work again? The question was asked with such hope, such faith in the adult world's ability to repair what had been broken, that Alice felt her heart squeeze with love and determination. She looked around the room, at Jennifer's tear-streaked face, at Michael's shame and confusion, at Sarah's careful hopefulness, at the children who just wanted their family to work the way families were supposed to work. Yes, Alice said finally. I think maybe we can fix it. But it's going to require all of us to be honest about what we really want and what we're really afraid of. She turned to Jennifer directly. And it's going to require you to believe that there's room in this family for both of us to matter, both of us to contribute, both of us to be important to these children. Jennifer nodded, her expression tentative but genuine. I think I'd like to try to believe that. Good, Alice said. Because I've been thinking, sitting out there on that porch, about what your father would want for this family. And I don't think he'd want us to destroy ourselves fighting over who gets to love these children the most. She stood up slowly, feeling her joints protest the morning's ordeal but also feeling something lighter in her chest than she'd experienced in months. Now, she said, looking at Emma and Jake's eager faces, I believe someone mentioned that we haven't opened any Christmas presents yet, and that seems like something we should fix right away. Emma's face lit up with the kind of pure joy that only children could generate. Really? We can have Christmas now? We can have Christmas now? Alice confirmed. All of us. Together. But even as she said it, Alice knew that the real work was just beginning. They had identified the problems, acknowledged the hurts, admitted the fears. Now they had to figure out how to build something new from the wreckage of what had almost been lost forever. The living room filled with tentative movement as the family began to navigate this new emotional landscape. Emma and Jake approached the Christmas tree with the careful excitement of children who had learned that adult promises could be fragile things, while the adults arranged themselves around the room with the awkward formality of people who had just aired years of hidden grievances. Alice found herself standing beside the tree, looking at the presents she had wrapped with such care weeks ago. The red and gold papers suddenly seemed like artifacts from a different era, from a time when she had assumed her place in this family was secure and understood. Now everything would have to be negotiated, rebuilt from the ground up. Where should we start? Jennifer asked, her voice still thick from crying but carrying a genuine desire to make things right. Before Alice could answer, Sarah stood up from the couch with the purposeful movement of someone whose therapeutic training had finally kicked in. I think we should start with some ground rules, some agreements about how we're going to move forward. Sarah, Alice said gently, this is Christmas morning. Can't we just… Mom, Sarah interrupted with the loving firmness of a daughter who knew her mother's tendency to smooth over problems rather than address them. We can't just pretend the last 4 hours didn't happen. We need to establish some basic understanding before we can really celebrate anything. Amanda nodded from her position by the window. Sarah's right. Otherwise, you're just putting a pretty bow on a broken foundation. Mrs. Wilson, who had been quietly observing from Robert's recliner, spoke up with the authority of someone who had witnessed 3 generations of family dynamics. In my experience, the holidays that matter most are the ones where people tell the truth to each other. Emma looked up from examining a particularly large present with her name on it. What kind of truth? The kind where everyone says what they really want, Mrs. Wilson replied, instead of pretending and then getting mad when other people can't read their minds. The simplicity of the explanation seemed to cut through the adult complexity, And Alice saw Jennifer's expression shift with something that might have been relief. "Okay," Jennifer said slowly. "I can try that. I want to feel like this is my home too. Like I'm the mother here, not a guest who's being evaluated." She looked directly at Alice as she spoke, and Alice could see the courage it took to voice this need so directly. "And I want to learn," Jennifer continued, her voice gaining strength. "I want to know how to make Jake's favorite cookies, and how to tell the stories about Michael's childhood that make Emma laugh. But I want to learn because I choose to, not because I'm failing some test I didn't know I was taking." Alice felt something ease in her chest at Jennifer's honesty. "I want that too," she said. "And I want to still be part of this family's life. Not running it, not controlling it, but contributing to it. I want to see my grandchildren grow up, to be someone they can count on." She gestured around the room. "I want to know that 31 years of Christmas memories in this house mean something, that they're not just obstacles to your independence." Michael had been listening to this exchange with the careful attention of someone trying to navigate between loyalties. Now he spoke up, his voice carrying the uncertainty of someone who was still figuring out his own role. "I want to stop feeling like I have to choose between you," he said, looking between his mother and his wife. "I want to be able to love both of you without feeling like I'm betraying someone." The admission hung in the air with the weight of years of emotional exhaustion. Sarah nodded with professional recognition. "That's called triangulation," she said. "When two people can't resolve their conflict directly, so they put a third person in the middle to carry the emotional burden. It's incredibly damaging to families." "Great," Michael said with a weak smile. "New rule," Sarah contributed. "I get to be a regular family member instead of the designated conflict resolver." Emma clapped her hands with delight. "And new rule. We open presents now because it's Christmas and we've been waiting forever." The laughter that followed felt different from the polite family chuckles Alice was used to. It felt genuine, earned, grounded in the honesty they had finally managed to share with each other. "Actually," Alice said, reaching into her purse, "before we open presents, I have something for Jennifer." She pulled out an envelope that she had been carrying since early December, waiting for the right moment to give it. Jennifer took it with curious caution, opening it to reveal a deed transfer document. "What is this?" Jennifer asked. "It's the house," Alice said simply. "Really yours this time. No strings, no conditions, no fine print. I realized this morning that you were right about needing to feel like adults, like this is truly your home, so it is." Jennifer stared at the document, her eyes filling with tears again. "Alice, I can't. This is too much, after everything that happened today. Especially after everything that happened today," Alice said firmly. "I don't want you to feel like you're living in my house anymore. I want you to feel like I'm a welcome guest in yours." The gesture seemed to complete something that had been broken since early morning. Jennifer looked around the room, at her husband, her children, her extended family, and Alice could see her taking ownership not just of the property, but of her role as the center of this family's daily life. "Thank you," Jennifer said simply, but the words carried the weight of forgiveness and new beginnings. "Now," Alice said, clapping her hands together with the authority of someone who had spent 31 years orchestrating Christmas mornings. "I believe someone mentioned presents?" Emma and Jake descended on the tree with the enthusiasm that had been building all morning, while the adults arranged themselves around the room to watch. But Alice noticed something different in the way they settled in. Jennifer sat in the chair that Alice usually occupied during gift opening, while Alice took a spot on the couch between Sarah and Amanda. The change felt natural, appropriate, like everyone had finally found their right place. As the children began the joyful chaos of unwrapping presents, Alice felt something she hadn't experienced in months. The sense that she belonged here not because she owned anything or controlled anything, but because she was loved and valued and wanted. Christmas could begin again, built on a foundation of honesty instead of assumption, of collaboration instead of competition. It wouldn't be exactly like the Christmases of the past, but it might be something better, a celebration that made room for everyone to contribute, everyone to matter, everyone to belong. The wrapping paper flew, the children squealed with delight, and the adults who had nearly destroyed their family that morning found themselves laughing together as they watched the next generation discover the magic of Christmas morning. It wasn't perfect. There would be more conversations to have, more boundaries to negotiate, more adjustments to make. But it was real. And it was theirs. And it was enough. Christmas morning light filtered through the living room windows as the gift exchange drew to a close, wrapping paper scattered across the floor like colorful snow. Emma sat surrounded by her new art supplies, already sketching in a journal Alice had given her, while Jake carefully arranged his new building blocks with the methodical precision he'd inherited from his grandfather. The children's contentment was complete and uncomplicated, their world restored to the proper order of Christmas joy. But Alice could see that the adults were still processing the morning's emotional upheaval. There was a tentative quality to their interactions, like people learning to walk again after a long illness. The breakthrough had been real, but the work of rebuilding would take time. Sarah had been watching her family with the careful attention of someone monitoring vital signs. Now she stood up from the couch, her movement drawing everyone's attention. "I need to say something," Sarah announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had reached an important decision. "About David." Alice felt her chest tighten. David's phone call had been temporarily forgotten in the crisis of resolution, but his absence from this family reconciliation felt like an open wound that needed addressing. "He should have been here," Sarah continued, "not just physically, but emotionally. He should have been part of this conversation, part of figuring out how to move forward as a family." Michael's expression darkened. David made his choice a long time ago. He's got his own life in California, his own priorities. "That's exactly the attitude that's part of the problem," Sarah replied with surprising firmness. "We've all gotten so used to David being absent that we've stopped expecting him to show up. We've stopped holding him accountable for being part of this family." Jennifer looked up from helping Jake organize his new blocks. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we call him back, right now, and we tell him what happened here today, and we ask him to be part of whatever comes next." The suggestion hung in the air with the weight of family history. David had been pulling away from the family for years, citing distance and work obligations, and the general difficulty of maintaining close relationships across time zones. But Alice suspected there were deeper reasons: grief he hadn't processed, guilt about not being there during Robert's illness, the peculiar burden that fell on eldest children who felt responsible for fixing problems they hadn't created. "He might not answer," Michael said. "It's Christmas morning. He's probably busy with Rebecca's family." "Then we keep calling until he does answer," Amanda said matter-of-factly. "If he's really part of this family, then he needs to be part of this conversation." Alice looked around the room, at the faces of her children and grandchildren, at Jennifer, who was finally occupying her rightful place as the family's center, at Mrs. Wilson, who had witnessed their entire morning's journey from crisis to resolution. "I think Sarah's right," Alice said finally. "We can't rebuild this family with one piece missing." She reached for her phone, but Emma spoke up before she could dial. "Can I talk to Uncle David first?" Emma asked, her 10-year-old voice carrying surprising authority. "I want to tell him about Christmas." There was something in Emma's tone that made all the adults pause. Children had a way of cutting through adult complications with devastating clarity, and Emma had already proven herself to be the family's most effective diplomat. "What would you say to him, sweetheart?" Alice asked. Emma considered the question with the seriousness she brought to all important matters. "I'd tell him that we almost didn't have Christmas today because the grown-ups were being silly, but then we figured out how to fix it. And I'd ask him why he doesn't want to be part of fixing it too." The simple formulation made David's absence seem like a choice rather than an inevitability. And Alice realized that Emma was right. They had spent so many years accommodating David's distance that they had forgotten to challenge it. Alice dialed David's number and set the phone to speaker. It rang several times before David's familiar voice answered, though he sounded distracted. "Mom, is everything okay? You never call twice in one day." "Everything is..." Alice paused, looking around the room at her family. "Everything is complicated, David. We've had quite a morning here." "What kind of morning?" David's voice carried the wariness of someone who had learned to avoid family drama. "The kind where we almost destroyed Christmas but then figured out how to save it," Emma announced, moving closer to the phone. "Hi, Uncle David. It's Emma." "Emma! Hey, kiddo!" "What do you mean?" almost destroyed Christmas? Before any of the adults could intervene, Emma launched into a 10-year-old's version of the morning's events. Her account was ruthlessly factual and entirely without diplomatic cushioning. Grandma Alice had been locked out, everyone had been crying and fighting, Mommy had been mean but then felt sorry. Grandma Alice had almost moved to Florida but then decided not to, and now they were all friends again and opening presents. The silence on the other end of the phone stretched long enough that Alice wondered if the call had dropped. "David?" she said finally. "I'm here." His voice had changed, carrying a note of shock that suggested Emma's recounting had cut through his carefully maintained distance. "Did she just say that Jennifer locked you out of the house?" "It's more complicated than that," Jennifer said, speaking directly to the phone. "But yes, essentially, that's what happened." Another long silence. Then, "Jesus, Jennifer, what were you thinking?" "I was thinking that I needed to feel like an adult in my own home," Jennifer replied, her voice steady despite the obvious difficulty of admitting this to someone she barely knew. "I was wrong about how to make that happen, but I wasn't wrong about needing it." Alice could almost hear David processing this information, trying to fit it into his understanding of family dynamics he had been avoiding for years. "And Mom," David said slowly, "you were just sitting outside? In the cold?" "For about 3 hours," Alice confirmed. "It gave me time to think." "About moving to Florida," Jake added helpfully, moving closer to the phone. "But she's not going to now because we fixed Christmas." David's laugh came through the phone, but it sounded strained. "Okay, I'm obviously missing a lot here, but the important thing is that everyone's okay now?" "We're better than okay," Sarah interjected. "We're actually talking to each other for the first time in years. We're being honest about what we need and what we're afraid of. We're figuring out how to be a family that works for everyone." That's great," David said, but his tone suggested he wasn't sure how to respond to this level of family emotional processing. "David," Alice said gently, "we want you to be part of that, part of figuring out how to move forward." "I'm in California, Mom." "I can't exactly be part of day-to-day family dynamics from 3,000 miles away." "No," Amanda said, her architect's practicality cutting through the excuse. "But you can be part of the big decisions. You can be present for the important conversations. You can stop treating this family like an obligation you've outgrown." The bluntness of Amanda's statement created another silence, but this one felt different. Not uncomfortable, but challenging. "Uncle David," Emma said into the quiet, "do you not love us anymore?" The question was asked with a child's direct simplicity, and Alice could hear David's sharp intake of breath through the phone. "Of course I love you, Emma. I love all of you." "Then why don't you come visit? Why don't you want to have Christmas with us?" David's answer, when it came, carried a vulnerability that Alice hadn't heard from her eldest son in years. "Because it's hard, sweetheart. Being with family is hard when you feel like you've let everyone down." "How did you let us down?" Jake asked, moving close to Emma so his voice would carry to the phone. "I wasn't here when Grandpa got sick. I didn't help take care of him. I didn't help Grandma Alice when she needed support. I just stayed away because it was easier than facing how bad I felt about not being the son I should have been." The admission hung in the air like a confession that had been waiting years to be spoken. Alice felt her heart break a little for this son who had been carrying guilt she hadn't even known about. "David," she said softly, "your father understood why you couldn't be here more. You had your own family to take care of, your own responsibilities. He never blamed you for that." "But I blamed me," David replied, "and then after he died, it felt too late to start being present. Like I'd missed my chance to be the kind of son and brother you all deserved." Sarah leaned toward the phone, her therapeutic training engaged but tempered by sisterly love. "It's not too late, David. That's what today taught us. It's never too late to start being honest about what we need from each other." "We almost lost everything this morning," Michael added, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had learned hard lessons about the consequences of avoidance. "But we didn't lose it, because we finally started talking, really talking." Mrs. Wilson, who had been quietly observing this family reconciliation, spoke up with the authority of someone who had watched 3 generations navigate love and loss. "Young man, in my 83 years, I've learned that the only thing worse than family drama is family loneliness. You can choose to be part of the mess, or you can choose to be alone. But you can't choose to be family without choosing to be present." The wisdom in her words seemed to reach through the phone, and when David spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "I want to be present," he said quietly. I don't know how to start." "You start by coming to visit," Emma announced, with the practical authority of a child who had solved many problems that day. "You start by being here for next Christmas. You start by calling more and asking how we are instead of just saying you're too busy." "Emma's right," Alice said. "You start small, and you build from there. The same way we're all going to have to build this new version of our family." "Okay," David said, and his voice carried a determination that Alice hadn't heard in years. "Okay, I'll book a flight. Maybe for New Year's? Would that work for everyone?" The enthusiasm in the room was immediate and unanimous. Even Jennifer, who barely knew David, nodded her agreement. "It would work perfectly," Alice said. "And David? Bring Rebecca and the kids. It's time they met their Texas family properly." "I will. And Mom? I'm sorry. For all of it. For not being here, for not calling enough, for letting you think I didn't care." "We're all sorry for things we've done wrong," Alice replied. "But we're not going to let sorry define us anymore. We're going to let love define us." After they hung up, the room fell into a comfortable quiet. The children had returned to their new toys. The adults were processing the morning's revelations, and the late morning sun was filling the space with golden warmth. Jennifer stood up and walked to the mantel, carefully retrieving the family photos she had hidden away. She began arranging them among the Christmas decorations, creating a display that honored both past and present. "New tradition," she announced. "Every Christmas, we add a new photo to the collection, but we keep all the old ones too, so we remember how we got here." Alice watched her daughter-in-law integrate 30 years of family history into her vision of Christmas, and felt something settle in her chest that had been restless for months. This was what evolution looked like, not the destruction of the past, but its integration into something new and vital. "I have one more gift," Alice said, reaching for the small wrapped package she had saved for last. She handed it to Jennifer with a smile. "It's not much, but I thought you might like it." Jennifer unwrapped the package carefully, revealing a small leather-bound book. She opened it to find Alice's handwritten recipes. Every family favorite, every holiday tradition, every secret technique that had made Alice's cooking legendary in the Thompson family. "I wrote down everything I could think of," Alice explained, "but I left space at the end for you to add your own recipes, your own traditions. I thought maybe we could build something new together." Jennifer hugged the book to her chest, tears threatening again. "Thank you. This is perfect." "And," Alice added with a smile, "I was hoping you might teach me some of those catering techniques you mentioned. I'd like to learn something new too." As the morning shifted toward afternoon, the family began the comfortable routine of Christmas dinner preparation. But this time, it was different. Jennifer took the lead in the kitchen while Alice assisted, their roles clearly defined but collaborative. Michael and Sarah worked together to set the table using the good china. Not because Alice insisted, but because Jennifer chose to honor the tradition while making it her own. The children played contentedly with their new toys, secure in the knowledge that their family had weathered its crisis and emerged stronger. Mrs. Wilson had been invited to stay for dinner, adding one more place to their table and one more voice to their celebration. As Alice looked around at her family, gathered in the kitchen, working together, planning for David's visit, building something new from the foundation of what they had almost lost, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This wasn't the Christmas she had planned when she woke up that morning. It was something better. A Christmas built on truth instead of assumption, on collaboration instead of control, on love that was strong enough to survive conflict and generous enough to make room for everyone. The house filled with the sounds of family life, conversation and laughter, the the clink of dishes being prepared, children's voices raised in play. It was the music Alice had been afraid of losing, but now she understood that it didn't belong to her alone. It belonged to all of them, and it would continue long after she was gone because she had finally learned to share it instead of hoarding it. Christmas had been saved, but more than that, the family had been reborn. Not as it was, but as it could be: honest, inclusive, resilient enough to face whatever challenges the future might bring. And that, Alice thought as she watched Jennifer confidently direct the dinner preparations while consulting the recipe book Alice had given her, was the greatest gift of all. The new tradition had begun. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Quote,